Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get our discussion underway. Welcome to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Miranda EDITH SKLAROFF, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Penn. This event is part of the Andrea Mitchell Center's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy series. Thank you to Dr. Jeff Green and Dr. Matt Roth for hosting us. I'm excited to discuss the book Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation with its authors, Dr. Sophie Lewis. Lewis is a freelance writer living in Philadelphia, teaching courses for the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Her first book was Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. Her essays have appeared in many venues, including the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, the Boston Review, N+1, the London Review of Books, and Salvage. Lewis studied English, politics, environment, and geography at Oxford, the New School, and Manchester University, and is now an unpaid visiting scholar at the Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, we will be focusing on her newest book, Abolish the Family. Even though we live at a moment of particular crisis, you may have noticed that when it comes to media coverage, governmental policy, and rhetoric on both the left and the right wing, the family is always in crisis. Writing at this pivotal moment of economic and political upheaval, scholar Sophie Lewis presents a book that speaks both to the role of family abolition and liberation struggles since the 19th century, and also to the present-day fight for care and liberation beyond the family. Sophie, thank you so much for being with us here today.
It's a huge pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we're just going to jump right in for a Q&A. We'll be having a discussion for about the first 45 minutes, and then we'll jump over for audience questions. Feel free to ask your questions whenever you think of them, and we'll save them for the separate Q&A point. But I think just to start off with, I'm going to ask the very basic question, which is also the title of the event, which is, what is family abolition, and how is it different from how its detractors might present it, and even how people who might hear the word for the first time and what their responses might be. What is family abolition, and how is it a little bit different from just putting those two words together?
Yeah, so I think of abolition of the family as pretty much synonymous with the deprivatization of care in society. The definition that I think is most important of the family is actually to do with the privatization of care, labor in society. That's perhaps a bit counterintuitive to people who, don't think of the family as, well, perhaps don't think of it very much at all. In fact, we're not very much used to thinking of the family as a structural phenomenon, let alone a sort of extension of institutions of the state, or indeed an economic site of activity at all, right? But there's an immense amount of sort of ideological naturalization that creates that sort of unthinking that we do every day about what we are doing when we do the family, and in a sense acquiesce to the private-public division in capitalist society, which currently has reached a point of intensification so extreme that even the propertied classes in the COVID pandemic are kind of writing op-eds about how something needs to change on the level of how we live privately, or perhaps too privately. But what I'm thinking about when I talk about abolition of the family actually has a very long history. And I go into that a little bit in my very short book, which we're gathering here today to discuss. And it's a very whistle-stop tour, but in some senses, it's been an orthodox kind of Marxist demand, not one that is necessarily remembered by all, Marxists. Unfortunately, to my mind, but it also has, a really strong history among sort of anti-imperialist, gay and lesbian, Black, third world radical traditions in the sort of so-called red decade of the 60s and early 70s, where, abolition of the family was a very sort of elementary, really quite familiar and well-known element of, the overthrow of capitalist society as a whole. So I guess, I've basically given you what I think it is. It's the idea that we can, reproduce our lives and make people in a way that is much more, centered in the common and the public realm, rather than depending so much on atomized and free labor in private nuclear households. What it is not, since you also asked me, what it's not about separating people. It's not about a top-down, sort of deletion of infrastructure in one stroke. It's certainly not about somehow, failing to appreciate the immense amount of, life-giving work that the family does in the world for many, many people today, right? But the family in many contexts, for marginalized and racialized and undocumented communities, is often the only sort of fence against the racial terror of the state. It's a sort of infrastructure that helps protect people, against much worse realities, including the kind of depredations of the labor market and so on. And I just want to be really clear that it's not about, family abolition is not about saying, that everything the family does is somehow bad. And there's also a recognition, I think, that has always been present in this politics, that if emancipatory and liberatory social justice forces don't prevail and don't win, that it's possible that something worse than the family does exist, and that doesn't really bear thinking about. But the other, the fact is also that the family is already a crisis. It is part of the crisis of capitalism, the social reproduction crisis, as Marxist feminists would call it. Social reproduction being the sort of ensemble of activities that remake a human person every day, so that that person can go back to work and sell more labor to the capitalist class to generate value. Social reproduction also, reproduces people who don't work, on the labor market. So from the point of view of the bosses and the capitalists, that's kind of a waste, right? So there's a lot of kind of elements of what happens in the family that is not directly kind of serving the system, and that's why I think we kind of partly rightly experience the family as a zone away from the logics of the economy, and from the sort of, discipline of the state, and that's not, like I say, there is a tiny bit of truth to that, right? We feel attached to this zone because we think of it as a sort of sanctuary and a sort of haven. Unfortunately, it's not actually a pure haven or a pure refuge at all, and it props up very much these systems that ultimately wear us down, force us into lifetimes of backbreaking work, which recently, with the Great Resignation and the Big Quit, we saw people kind of reaching a breaking point in relation to. And I thought it was interesting that the crises about sort of pods and quarantines and the sort of rejection of work came together in our recent history, because I think of work and the family as, completely inseparable, and we can get into that later. And I should stop talking really, but yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that it's certainly not about saying, families suck, and we just want to kind of get rid of them. We can get into what abolition actually means, right? But it's certainly not about separating or diminishing the amount of care that we receive in the world. On the contrary, it's about recognizing that if you love the people in your family, you probably agree that they deserve a lot more than the organized scarcity that is the private nuclear household that currently arranges the care that we get.
Great. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to jump a little bit ahead in my questioning since you brought up work and care. And I think that this is one of the many sort of important parts, or many important things that this book, but also the sort of like, sort of movement or sort of beginning of a philosophical re-embracing of family abolition can kind of talk about. But, what you trace the sort of family abolition through lots of liberatory movements, not movies, sorry. Black Power, gay liberation, through the feminist movements and sort of various iterations. But one of the things I think is interesting is that you sort of point to basically 1985 to 2015 as this kind of desert of family abolitionism. Like it kind of slips off of a lot of radical to-do lists, if those to-do lists still exist, or sort of these, don't think in 2015 we really heard that many sort of feminists talk about family abolition. I think it's sort of becoming more, again, more popularized. But what's sort of your, again, this is inviting you to sort of sum up parts of your books, which I don't want you to have to do too much, but what is your sort of read of like why and how family abolition, or even marriage abolition, or children's liberation, which is another question I have, how some of these sort of family-oriented demands did stop feeling pressing or necessary? And is it just because some of those movements waned or changed? It seems like it did happen kind of within a small amount of time.
Yes, great question. I mean, it's a question I ongoingly feel curious about, and I don't believe I have the sort of complete answer. But another brief comment just before I answer is though that I have been challenged a little bit on my sort of statement that it's a complete sort of lull in family abolitionist imagination in between, the mid-80s and more or less 2015. I think it is a bit of an overstatement on my part that that light completely went out. And some radicals, who were really active around the sort of so-called alter globalization movements of the late 90s and early 2000s were sort of asking me why I didn't include some of the radical sort of infrastructures of mutual aid and, cohabitation and squatting and so on in my history, which is actually a really good point. I don't think the history of family abolition is ever really entirely kind of, a flat line, in it. I might need to change my potted history just to say this is a tiny pamphlet and a very much more in-depth book by my comrade and friend M.E. O'Brien is actually forthcoming next year from Pluto Press. So we're all a little, we're collaborating here in the 21st century to flesh out this history in greater depth. But yeah, basically what happened at the end of the red decade I mentioned, and I've been revisiting this history by looking at the historian Alice Eccles's sort of account of 1967 to 1975 and what happened to the women's liberation ecology, which is a parallel history to histories you can read of what happened to gay liberation and what happened to Black Power. And, more or less, the story is, the liberatory and critically utopianist movements were stomped into the dust. It's simple as that. On one level, I cannot insist enough that, those of us who feel that we are, in a sense, the transgenerational, comrades or allies of those new left revolutionaries, have to metabolize still today, no matter what age we are, the grief of that, right? The sheer kind of multiplicity of psychological sort of cope that we tend to fall into when we're not capable collectively of simply facing the fact that we lost. It's very sort of common to look inward, what was done wrong, what were the mistakes. It's not that that's entirely not useful, it is probably useful to think about what alliances were missing, what connections were missed, but I do think there's a tendency to turn away from some of the aspirations of that moment where everything seemed possible, on the basis that it was wrong to have tried, because it didn't work out. And Ellen Willis, as I talk about in Abolish the Family, describes the turning away from horizons like family abolition and children's liberation at the very end of the 70s, sort of writing in the Village Voice. Ellen Willis is describing, how people that 5 years prior were all down, for really transforming society completely, and necessarily that would include, the social factory of the home, not just the kind of public sphere and the formal workplace of the factory. But however, during the course of the 70s, like the sense that was even sayable, thinkable, just kind of like disappeared. And I've noticed myself in the archive that, in the early 70s, you have these texts from Black radicals in Oakland saying, so Pat Parker, for instance, was a sort of anti-imperialist feminist nurse who says at a meeting, a convergence, that basically white women need to get with it and be brave in saying abolish the family. And so it's kind of like my impression that, which I think is shared by many, that the only feminists talking about, family abolition are, well, actually just one, the sort of famous, infamous New York Jewish revolutionary Shulamith Firestone. At least that, when I say I thought, that was my impression, I would say 10 years ago. I think it's a common one, that there's this kind of black sheep almost of the movement who said these sort of unreasonable things about the family. In fact, when you really go and look through the written record of the movements, Firestone actually seems quite, timid almost in comparison with the united front of certain kinds of, anti-imperialist revolutionary Black groups who are saying that the family obviously has to be overthrown if capitalism and the state are going to be defeated. But then at the end of the 70s and by the mid 80s, in 1984, we have this other very famous text, which is also extremely strong and powerful and reasoned for its moment. And that is Hazel Carby's letter, sort of White Woman Listen, in which she's saying that white women are overemphasizing the oppressive character of the family. And that while Black women would not deny that the family has a sort of structurally oppressive function in society, what needs to happen right now, i.e., in the context of triumphing neoliberalism, and accelerating sort of austerity and terrorization of Black life and Black households is frankly to acknowledge the role that family has played in the history of Black resistance against the state, right? And those two moments, are so fascinating, because as I say, it's not about saying, you know, one of them is kind of more right than the other. It's about recognizing that something materially, you know, gargantuan happened. That the terrain of political possibility completely changed, you know. So yeah, and the same can be said. I would briefly just say, you know, Anita Bryant spelled the defeat of the gay liberation horizon, you know. So I mean, not her personally in and of herself, but the sort of the isolation of gay liberationists in the context of the wider revolutionary left, which is also, I think, maybe a valid criticism, and you know, but given that that this is one of the times where it is important to recognize there was a failure of solidarity from the wider left when you know, the organized forces that wanted to re-privatize care, if you like, even more deeply in the context of a, you know, a neoliberal revolution, that they started saying, and indeed we should think about this today, given what is happening with trans children and their bodily autonomy today, you know, they started saying, you know, gay people are groomers and pedophiles, and they, you know, and they destroy the basis of, you know, American capitalist life. That third thing is perhaps something that could have been leaned into, you know, the fear that comes with the suggestion of sort of, you know, sexual threat to children, the weaponization of the sexual innocence of the child, is something that back then in the early 80s and still today, we do not have a brave, united kind of left response to, right? So when someone gets called a groomer in this weaponized, organized way, the template for which was laid by Anita Bryant in the 80s and the sort of Reaganite campaign of organized homophobia and sort of, you know, Christian evangelical capitalism on steroids, you know, yeah, well, you know, we lose an enormous amount of movement memory about where the location of sexual violence actually is in the world, right? And in the fabric of capitalist social reproduction, where the threat to children actually is the private patriarchal nuclear household, right? And when we sort of capitulate to the sorts of moves that make a kind of threat and a, you know, a social, you know, terror out of the figure of the queer person, you know, we throw out this enormous and indispensable component of, you know, of utopian wisdom, and we kind of refragment ourselves, which is why, as I guess I was trying to say earlier, the history is quite fragmented, right? When I do my potted history, one of the tragic things about it is that the different sort of instances of family abolitionist imaginary do not have as many kind of links between them as I would like to be able to say they do.
Okay, great. We're getting in some great questions that we will get to at the end, which also some of them are entangled with some of the questions I have. So I'm going to skip to one that's maybe not, has not come up among questions from the audience. Just as a reminder, you can put in your questions whenever, and we will, in about 15 minutes, we'll start answering them, if not a little bit earlier. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how your work, not just in this book, but I think more broadly has taken up with the idea of mothering against motherhood, which I believe is originally from Adrienne Rich. And the idea is that the practice of care could be degendered and an action, not a fixed identity. This is how I understand it, at least. And as the action, it could be potentially shared by all. Is there any similar recuperation of fathering in the idea of family abolition, and why or why not?
So in a word, no. And, you know, this is basically one of the sort of revolutionary feminist commitments in my project, really, which is not at all to imply some sort of, association between mothering and female gender. In fact, I think the strategic, necessity, the way we get through is by insisting in a sort of spirit of feminism against cisness, to sort of borrow from Emma Heaney's collection, which is forthcoming and I'm very excited about, that, the category that, we must center as feminists is this kind of anti-productive labor. And I mean anti, not just sort of non-productive. I actually mean sort of, the valences of social reproduction that produce, comrades, not workers. That's kind of what I mean by anti-productive, like the care of one another, Sorry, this may be a little bit kind of overly abstract as a response. Let me just kind of wheel it back. So when you ask me about whether I have a category of fathering to mirror the revolutionary horizon of mothering against motherhood, the answer is no, because not because of a sort of hetero-pessimist kind of dislike for men. That's not sort of on the contrary, because already all of the men who are involved in care are basically mothering, and the best dads in that sense are kind of already motherers. Motherer is the sort of word I have for the ungendered kind of affinity rather than identity, for a labor that sort of holds and nurtures and creates, So when you think about fathering in everyday language, it's an act of authorship, it's an act of intellectual property patenting, if you like. It's like, I mean, this sounds maybe, overly critical, but it actually is how we think about progeny. It's how we think about heredity. It's how we think about, biogenetic kinship. The gestational component is a labor. Well, if we think of it as a labor, I argue in my previous book that gestating is a labor. It's certainly recognized that post-gestational, maternal care is a labor in our society. But the sort of fathering aspect is the instant where the sperm hits the egg and the identity is inscribed. That's what it means to father a child. It means to ejaculate and inscribe, genetic futurity. So it's not, it's a moment of fantasized, as I said, sort of authorship, licensing. And since my family abolitionism is very much about the buried history of children's liberation, which you already raised, the idea that children, whilst they have very special sort of entitlements and needs, are people, and as such don't, belong to anyone as possessions, and are certainly not, and this is also just scientific fact, the extensions of anybody or the sort of reproductions of anybody. In fact, Marxist biologists are quite clear, Marxist feminist biologists are quite clear that, and I know you do eugenic science research yourself, Miranda, but the reproduction of the self is not something that actually happens in sexuate reproduction. It's a fantasy we have that is very central to the functions of the family that have to do with the transmission of class, of racial stability and racial identity, the administrative coherence of populations for the state, and so on and so forth, So I'll just stop there, shall I? It's not about sort of disliking a particular gender of person. It's about recognizing that patriarchy is one of capitalism's primary functions, in the way that it kind of creates identities as part of the privatization of care.
Okay, great. I'm going to pick up on one thing you said. I'm going to just say I do anti-eugenics, just to make sure that no one thinks I do eugenic science. Not the just a side note, but I work on anti-eugenic theory on eugenics. I always feel the need to slide that in when talking, but I wanted to pick up your mention of children's liberation, because this is also one that maybe Shulamith Firestone was most famous for, putting in this sort of like feminist ideological discourse, but again used to be sort of a bigger political demand that I think radicals were making in maybe the 60s and the 70s. And so it comes up frequently in your book, but it's not always named. It's definitely there in spirit. Is children's liberation something that's sufficient for getting at the kind of freedom that you think of, that you're aiming towards with something like family abolition, or is there something that it lacks, or just a different emphasis? How do you sort of see those two conceptual frameworks related?
Children's liberation is an under-theorized tradition, although there is a lot on it. It perhaps is quite fitting that it's somewhat under-theorized because, children do not tend to theorize as much as else, that perhaps that's not true. Perhaps it's about the mode in which their theorizing occurs. But no, I wouldn't say they're synonyms at all. I would say that the very vexed but crucial question of how children's autonomy can be nourished and supported and safeguarded at the same time as their care is ensured, is one of the central things that you need to be thinking about if you want to think about deprivatizing care, i.e., abolishing the family. But I don't think they're synonyms. I think the contempt with which some, on the left treat the phrase, adult supremacy, right, which comes from the anarchist tradition, where indeed much of the, excellent sort of mutual aid infrastructure and knowledge came from during the pandemic that kept people alive, and where many of the sort of youth liberation or youth autonomy frameworks are being sort of maintained and developed and experimented with, led by young people, today in social centers such as the now defunct Purple Thistle in Vancouver, Canada, the contempt with which those notions are treated sometimes as though it couldn't possibly be serious, to challenge the sorts of proprietarian hierarchy that exists between adults and children, depresses me somewhat. I think it's yet another legacy of the crushing of, the utopian imagination in the rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism. Yes, indeed, it used to be quite common, even in Marx's day, right, to talk about children as the poorest proletarians in the world, right? This remains very much the case, and we haven't talked enough yet about the deeply sort of interlinked sort of character of children's liberation and, the abolition of whiteness, prison abolition of the police, and so on. But I will say, the racism of the family norm in the United States is something that is forcefully institutionalized through child protective services, right, CPS, right, which is, as Dorothy Roberts, who is one of our, leading lights at University of Pennsylvania, she identifies as a sort of family policing system, right? And as she has recently made really clear in an interview in Parapraxis magazine, a new magazine from, the horizons of sort of, nurturing children's freedom and autonomy, in a world where that sort of freedom and autonomy is, attacked not primarily, although sometimes also, by people close to children in Black communities. The sanctity of parenthood is not respected by the state, right? This is why polemically some theorists and philosophers have suggested that the Black family is an oxymoron, because its perimeter is always permeable to the police, but when children need to be protected from the state, and in that sense their relationships to their loved ones need to be affirmed, that doesn't have to contradict the eventual horizon of abolition of the family in the sense of the privatization of care. And so you can transform the family while defending families against police brutality, right? And that's the kind of thing that needs to have children as political actors at its core, because it's simultaneously true that the family, regardless of, the racial, character of that family, is the most dangerous place for, for children in terms of the likelihood of child sexual abuse. The family is where the overwhelming majority of child sexual abuse happens. It's where the overwhelming majority of rape happens on this planet. It's where, for women, one is most likely to be murdered. The majority of women, according to at least one recent study, who are killed by an intimate partner, right? A domestic partner or family member, and that used to be a kind of basic feminist point, that children and women, and ideally, depending on which movement, because unfortunately these alliances weren't made, but gay and queer people and gender non-conforming and trans people together are the constituency that need to struggle as a class, united against the private nuclear household, i.e. patriarchal capitalist, social reproduction. So, the role of children within feminism, that's something that I think I want to see underlined in the 21st century once again, the crucial sort of centrality in a sense of, children's bodily autonomy, children's own ideas about who they want to live with, how they want to live, why it makes sense, to multiply work over and over and over inside every single apartment and home, labor like laundry, labor like cooking, in a sense, historically it's almost been, useful to have children involved in these discussions, because children haven't had those kinds of norms naturalized in their minds so much compared to some grown-ups, and so when utopian architects and feminist urban planners talked about liberating children and women from the sort of work intensity of the private nuclear household, talked about putting kitchens in the public realm, kitchenless cities, which means you can cook privately if you want, if that gives you joy, but generally food will be prepared in the public space regardless, and you will be always able to get fed in the common space. That's what a kitchenless city is. So instead of having infinite multiplication, every single home has a laundry, an oven, a fridge, etc., which is just kind of bananas on some level, right? Like ecologically as much as anything else. You would consider certain needs to be meetable and automatically, naturally to be met in, appropriate to be met in the public and common space rather than turned inward to be met by kin, right? And it's about those needs and the direction we point them in, and you can trace the sort of the way that responsibilities and needs were kind of pointed, inward like that, right back to the enclosures in, medieval Europe, where laws were passed. Melinda Cooper kind of takes it from the enclosures to the poor laws, where the destitute and surplus populations of Europe were made into the legal responsibility of kin, not of the collective, but of kin. And that, in a sense, is one of the origin points of our general sense that, we are responsible and identifiable only with our own, and that we look out for our own, we draw a circle, and we compete, as a team, in a sense, and in a sense, kind of acquiesce to this blackmail that means that love for one another has to be interpreted as the act of laying down our lives in wage work for each other's survival, as though that it had to be that way, right?
Okay, great. We're going to go to our stack of questions, and I might interject throughout because some of them are very similar to some questions that I have. But our first one is from Julia, who says, would love to know how your new book connects to your last book, Full Surrogacy Now. What was your journey from the last book to this one? Does it continue / expand upon certain themes from Full Surrogacy? And are you hoping for a different audience between the two books? You're excited to read, and thanks for your important work.
Oh, thank you for that great question. Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't expect Full Surrogacy Now to be read as widely as it was, and in a sense my whole life changed when it was read so widely, because it enabled me to make a living outside of the academy and to think about writing more seriously and centrally and perhaps in a more accessible way. I do think that Abolish the Family is an easier read on some level. Although, I think Full Surrogacy Now also was on a line between scholarly and sort of non-scholarly in terms of its tone. Although who knows what a scholarly tone is. But I think the audiences I'm trying to reach with Abolish the Family are more diverse, because Full Surrogacy Now came out of a PhD about the political economy of the gestational, pregnancy, contract pregnancy industry, surrogacy, as we currently call it, but then trying to do a philosophical, inversion of the buried claims inside the word surrogacy in the present, what capitalist bioclinicians say surrogacy is, and trying to think whether that could still, persevere in a world in which we no longer thought that pregnancy generates essentially private property, and that children can only have one mother, and so on and so forth, so it's really about the sort of utopian idea that one day we might not just, which we already are, be the makers of one another, but also learn to act like it, which is the crucial point, because currently the ways that surrogates kind of manufacture everybody, all of us, and certainly the private nuclear household, the family home image, which looks like it's autonomous, but actually has all these kind of shadowy figures who get cut out of the family photo. That's a form of surrogation. It's just essentially reproductive stratification, to use Shelley Colin's term. It's capitalism, it's class, it's colonialism, you know. But a utopian surrogacy, another surrogacy is possible, right? So that was where I was going with that book, and it kind of took Abolition of the Family as almost as a starting point, or as a kind of, you know, an assumption really, which it turns out not everybody has heard of or agrees with. So I was asked, in a sense, to clarify what that part of my politics is, and what it has meant historically to other movements. Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of one answer to that. There's also been a clarification for me of some of my thinking. You know, one of the things I didn't address nearly enough really was the racial character of the family, the settler colonial formation of the family in the United States, for example. And so really part of my, you know, homework, part of my, you know, trajectory between Full Surrogacy Now and Abolish the Family was thinking really deeply about how family abolition is an anti-racist and a decolonial politics, and making up my mind about how to argue that convincingly, and becoming more sure about that component, basically, thanks to lots of conversations I had in the interim with people who were a little bit, you know, startled about how it would work in their organizing contexts as anti-racists, or, you know, migrant justice activists. So I hope you read that part of the book, and you know, and form your own opinion, obviously. But in a sense, that was the work I had to do.
So I'm jumping around with the questions a little bit, but this one is one from Itamar, which is family abolition in the nuclear family about the nuclear family, or is it also about abolishing extended families and biological kinship as such? And I sort of wanted to follow that question, because it does seem like one of the things I appreciate about many things I appreciate about Abolish the Family is that you're kind of clear at moments when you're departing from your previous work. And some of that seems to be a little bit around kinship and maybe like the kin and the difference between kin and kith, which I myself am not super well versed in. So maybe that question, but also if there's been some change in how you've been thinking about kinship along the two alongside the two books.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and certainly, as I maybe sort of indicated just a second ago, like one of the crucial questions really is which family, right? Which family are we abolishing? That's kind of the main, you know, question asked and answered in my second chapter. I think it's the second chapter. I couldn't figure out whether the history or the anti-racist argument should come first. But basically, you know, it's not just the nuclear, it's not just the white, it's not just the bourgeois family in a sense. It's the capitalist family. You know, bourgeois, white, cis heteropatriarchal, nuclear, those things are to some extent baked in. They're not always, you know, mapped out one for one in, you know, the lived life of families. But guess what? You know, the family is as many aspects of social discipline in, you know, many sort of shibboleths of capitalist reality. You know, it's a fiction, you know, like these families, you know, where are they, right? It doesn't matter that a vast majority of us don't live in anything like, you know, the image that I think you put on the poster for this event, you know, with a big kind of no block sign over it to show abolition, I guess. Which I do want to say, you know, is about simultaneous, you know, transformation, destruction, preservation. Let's get into the nerdiness of the concept of abolition in a minute, right? But, you know, yeah, in fact, let's do that in a minute. But no, it's unfortunately necessary to say, I kind of insist in this book, that all families all private households, regardless of their composition. And again, many of us kind of fall short of the sort of idealized template, right? Participate in this, public-private matrix, which privatizes care into private nuclear household, well, private households, whether they're nuclear or not, sorry. And so we don't escape, right, by happening to be queer, or by happening to be, even, in non-white formations, as sort of proletarians trying to, form ourselves into households. We're participating in the family as a logic of work, right? So it's that's the bad news and the good news. I think people want to exclude, the populations who seem closest to, a liberatory form of care from the politics of family abolition, right? So we have all these kinds of discourses, which I was very much participating in Full Surrogacy Now, sort of celebrating all the sort of extraordinary histories and skills that have been, generated at the margins of the family regime. And I don't sort of disavow that. I don't disavow that. I think, the forms of mothering against motherhood that have been generated by the descendants of captive populations, for example, or the refugees from the nuclear household of, in the form of queer children, those are the sort of, the closest thing I can point to in the present of sort of actually existing anti-families or whatever. But, that they're not somehow outside of the, the totality of the capitalist privatization of care, So I think that's what I hadn't worked out how to say yet in Full Surrogacy Now. I was sort of saying real families against the family. And I think the step that I say further in Abolish the Family is that it might be necessary to, unsettle the romanticization of kinship as a metaphor for our solidarities with one another. You asked me about kith and kin. So, historically, there used to be this other term used all the time, but it's kind of indicative that that one fell away. So we're kind of, no one's heard of kith, K-I-T-H, and it was kith and kin, meaning kin formed through legal or blood relations, right? So if you're kin, there's a state sanctioned or a blood imaginary in your relationship. When you're kith, there's no such piece of paper or imagined piece of paper. You are basically bonded together through action, through place. That's all, But I think it's sort of interesting because we only use family metaphorically today in shops, in airlines, in services, and also in very important emancipatory traditions, such as Latinx and Black churches and so on. Like everyday language is about kinship. And I think I'm sort of interested in what it would mean to cultivate a different sort of measuring stick, right, for what commitment means, because even though we don't think consciously about what we're saying when we use languages of kinship, I still think there is a sort of ghost of a thought there about how the only thing we can trust is something that is ratified, non-contingent, a connection that only God or the state through a really annoying legal process could dissolve. That's kind of what I'm saying when it's not what I think I'm saying, but it is kind of what I'm saying when I say we're family, right? Like you couldn't walk away from me even if you wanted to. You know, you'd have to divorce me, and that's a hassle. You know, that's the form of security we think we need, because we don't actually trust on some level. And why should we? Right? We are massively precaritized. You know, we're in a care crisis, so don't get me wrong, I understand. But like, we don't trust that we get up every morning and choose, you know, our love. Like, that love is, to quote Ursula Le Guin, you know, something that we remake every day, make new, like bread. I mean, that's not the right quote, but it's something similar to, you know, I'm almost saying that it's about putting faith in labor rather than, you know, the state, that, or in a sort of, you know, religiously inflected concept of kinship as identity, you know, and reproduction as a vehicle for immortality. But just like putting pressure in, putting faith, in, you know, our decisions every day, you know, to make kinship, because kinship actually is made, not given, you know, which kind of undermines, you know, the invocation of it as a sort of safety net. Anyway, sorry, this gets a little bit too philosophical, perhaps. I'm sort of suggesting in this new book, really, that all the forms of, you know, liberatory kin making that I do still celebrate do not in and of themselves sort of amount to family abolitionism, which I actually locate kind of somewhere else, maybe surprisingly or paradoxically. I sort of, I kind of want to say, don't try this at home, kids. Like, it's not really about going home and being like, right, how do I abolish the family here in my family, right? I actually locate the kernel of family abolition almost, you know, in the streets. Like, it's when we meet one another in the realm of the social, which, according to Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh, the Marxist feminists in the 80s who were keeping alive family abolition, is the sort of antithesis of the family. The social and the family in their book, which they call the anti-social family, are kind of antitheses. So if you want to learn how to abolish the family, you first have to sort of like exit the family and meet in the, you know, and form the social, revive the dream of sociality, and sort of almost learn what it would be like in the process of insurgency, you know, to reimagine relations completely, you know. So it's actually in the context of protest kitchens and mass occupations, you know, mass, you know, rioting and struggle, high intensity struggle, that I kind of locate the, you know, step one of abolishing the family, which is maybe not a very satisfactory answer, because people always want to know, how do we, you know, how do we do this? What do you mean concretely? Do you mean kibbutzes? Do you mean communes? Do you mean like going to Vermont and, you know, cooperatively parenting lots of kids with lots of other couples or whatever? Like, you know, none of that seems to me, you know, really like the structural solution that I'm envisaging. But also, I'm a theorist, not a policymaker, and, you know, the history of critical utopianism is, you know, an honorable one that sometimes tolerates a certain amount of unknowing. You know, it's about a method of denaturalization of the given, you know, and of cultivating the feeling of a widespread entitlement to desire, you know, more, to feel that one deserves more, you know, than the family, for the sake of one's family, for example. I really do reaffirm and insist that if you love the people currently in your family, you might be curious about what it might be like to love them outside of a matrix of coercion and blackmail.
So I think that tapped on a couple of different questions from the audience, which includes questions about concrete proposals. This one's from Jeff. What are some concrete proposals, institutionally speaking, that would define family abolition for Lewis? What would it mean for children in the household schooling? I think you kind of cover that with this sort of idea that in these sort of like revolutionary moments, like maybe some of what we saw happening in Philadelphia in 2020, but maybe another way to sort of get towards some of those questions is a question that I also had for you, which is like, what are some moments or experiments or occupations where you see the beginnings of family abolition? Or are there things that, you know, we can't go home and just, you know, live family abolitionistly in the context of our family, but are there some kinds of propositions that would be helpful? And also this sort of brings up, I know that Cuba has a new family code, which I thought was interesting because it like outlaws commercial surrogacy, but it allows all these different kinds of family formation. So maybe it's also, we could also talk a little bit about that as we're thinking of sort of more not to thrust you as a theorist, since I'm also a theorist, into the world of concrete, but maybe have some of those moments and policies that do sort of maybe make it easier down the line to sort of think through what a world where everyone is family and no one is family looks like.
Well, I mean, as well, you know, I suspect we will always have, you know, the desire to live with certain people until, you know, cohabiting is gonna, we have a need for shelter, right, and a need for intimacy. So it's not about doing away with all kinds of like preferences for certain people and relationships, you know. But you know, a concrete example of the sort of practices that inspire me in a family abolitionist way, or as a family abolition related kind of you know, phenomenon was, well, I mean, in 2006 there was an extraordinary teachers protest in Oaxaca in Mexico. You know, large numbers of people, many of them women. At one point, 3,000 police attacked them because they'd been occupying the central square of the city for over a month. And you know, the conflagration sort of only escalated and gained support and strength, and women were very much kind of leading the transformation of what was originally a sort of teacher's strike into what was eventually called the Oaxaca Commune, you know, explicitly referencing the Paris Commune. And there were these sorts of insurgent forms of social reproduction, according to, you know, people who reported in English about the events. You know, the barricades were places where the people of Oaxaca slept, cooked, and shared food, had sex, shared news, and came together at the end of the day. This is from a piece by Baruch Peller about this. What's interesting about this is that the family, in a sense, was part of the downfall of this commune, because by many accounts, lots of the women had frustrated husbands who sort of pulled their wives back into the private household because they felt, you know, emasculated, underserved, you know, underfed, so on, you know. But these are the sort of, like, the Oaxaca commune was really a moment of sort of radical possibility, I think, by all accounts, for people who realized that the atomized isolation of capitalist domesticity could in fact be challenged, could be thrown off, could be, even if only for a few months, unmade, you know. Yeah, I mean, I would also say maybe a little bit more pragmatically, and I don't know if everyone wants to hear this, but in my opinion, almost every form of political struggle or campaign or you know, movement that aims to bring about infrastructures of provisioning and nurturance in the public realm is in a sense related to family abolition, or family abolitionist, if you like, because it's the right to the city, for example, right? Having a materialized, not just an abstract right to be in the public space, to have one's needs met there. Ultimately, a lot of different leftist or left adjacent struggles are kind of aiming at that, and often there is no syllable, no hint of criticism of the family as part of that, because, and that's fine. I'm not saying like right now, people should sort of change their messaging and say, because, family is an organized structure of scarcity, and because we should be, diminishing the importance and the role of family in society, we are funding the public gardens in Philadelphia. Like, you don't have to do that bit. Like, it could still be true, but I'm not necessarily sure that family abolition is, as sometimes people ask me to explain, some sort of like, politics that you organize under the banner of, if that makes sense. I think it's one of those subcomponents of the abolition of the present state of things that we don't want to ever separate from the rest of it, right? I hope this has been obvious or implicit so far from everything I've said, but just in case, like, don't separate this from the struggle against capitalism. Bad things could happen if you did try. But since we were kind of circling around it, let's briefly touch on the meaning of abolition. And when, basically, I noticed in the chat that someone was sort of suggesting, oh, it sounds like a really different kind of use of the word abolition than is operative in the horizon of prison abolition or abolition of the police. And I actually just wanted to explain, no, in my opinion, actually, no, funnily enough. And that's a sort of sensibility I take from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who, as you also were remarking to me, Miranda, understands the matter of abolition as a sort of as a presencing, a question of presence and building, not of kind of tearing down and deleting. And so actually, the question of abolition for her when it comes to the criminal justice system is about the making of real justice, not simply the sort of destruction of the present infrastructure that pretends to deliver justice, right? So in the capitalist present, all the institutions that constitute capitalist justice are a kind of, evil joke, like of justice, right? A travesty of justice, And so abolition is kind of working with the tiny little filament inside that system that has something going for it, like our desire to be safe, our desire for justice, right? Which again is not what is delivered by the current system, but it kind of is propped up partly by our collective desire for that thing, right? So abolition is not really about setting fire to all the prisons and all the police stations, although great, like it's not that, but if you did that to all of the prisons and all of the police stations today, you wouldn't have abolished the carceral, justice system. You wouldn't even have come close, right? Abolition is where you've created the world that would make that system unthinkable, truly a strange, weird memory, like for us, it's quite hard to imagine. I mean, of course, slavery still exists in the present, right? And abolition is still an ongoing process with regard to slavery, but we can't really, it's very hard, I think, for many people today to imagine what it was like to have an overarching system of everyday normalized chattel slavery, and that's what we would be, that abolition is the day where really we almost can't imagine it at all anymore, right? And that's what like prison abolition would also be. The day when no one can imagine putting people in cages, the state doing that on a mass scale, right? That would be the day where we have abolished. And family is in a sense, it has a utopian kernel, right? It's this dream that people can be unconditionally loved. I mentioned earlier, M.E. O'Brien, and there's something very moving in her book, which I've been reading. It's coming out next year, where she describes the George Floyd uprising and the sort of moments of family abolitionist desire you might be able to read in that struggle. She actually looked at George Floyd's crying out for his mother while dying, under the boot of the police officer, Derek Chauvin. And I really admire her analysis there, because it's a crucial component, I think, of the sensibility of abolition that I'm reaching for myself as well. She writes that family abolition has to be an affirmation of that, of that call for his mother that George Floyd sort of uttered in his dying moments, not some kind of dismissal of it. M.E. O'Brien talks about Martin Luther King's vision of the beloved community. And I sort of see that as a very sort of noble, historical, link to draw between our hopes as, tender, fragile, needy animals, that our mothers in every sense, and as I say, I think mothering is a diffuse labor, will come to our aid, right? Our neediness in moments of horror and brutalization, right? That's actually what family, the kernel is, that I actually kind of want to abolish in the sense of preserve, because abolition does have a negation in it, but it also has, something about holding on, so that, again, with prisons, it's this idea that, we can find justice, somehow. This is not how to do it. With families, the love between people is, I think, not served well by the infrastructure of privatized households in capitalism. So it's actually about that relation between people, that mother love, if you like, and other forms as well, being generalized, universalized across all of society. Who knows what that would look like, but it's about, making sure that everyone actually gets to feel what it would be like red love is what Alexandra Kollontai called this, to be held, to be known, to be cared for outside of a system of economic coercion. I think I've said this now 3 times, but organized scarcity, which we then become very attached to because it's all we have. And in a moment where utopianism seems like something we can't afford, we find it very difficult to let go of the things to which we are attached, even when we recognize, their limitations. It's very scary, incredibly scary. My entire opening chapter is devoted to the psychological reaction we have, all of us, me included, to the idea of being manufactured in some different way outside of the isolated intensity of the sort of, usually parental dyad, 2 people or 1 or maybe a couple more, but, yeah, and I recognize that and I honor it, and I don't want to shy away from it, because I think that all really serious revolutionary politics actually contains something somewhat frightening of that kind,
Okay, we're going to jump to a different question from Hero, who asks, or states. You mentioned that you think cis women, trans people, gender non-conforming people, etc., as a class can fight as a class against the patriarchal family. Could you say a little bit more about what makes this group a class and why, if them being conceived as a class is important for family abolition?
Yeah, so I am not personally invested in the sort of sex class analysis of this so-called second wave, and I admit I sort of was speaking, I possibly misspoke when I used that terminology, although I think increasingly I've noticed theorists using the word class in a slightly looser sense as well. It's kind of having a comeback, I think, the notion of sort of you know, in different, anyway, I sorry, that's a rabbit hole I could go into. Just to say, you know, I don't propose that there is, you know, a sex class, right? This is a real mistake that occurred in the women's liberation moment, where a cultural feminist term started, you know, de-linking from the left, de-linking from anti-capitalism and de-linking from class, and just sort of denying that there are internal class antagonisms between, you know, between women, you know, within the sisterhood, you know, just to be clear. But what I think is useful is understanding that feminization as a process that orders bodies in a way that kind of affects a devaluation, like as Rosemarie Hennessy calls this, a sort of like a second skin. And it's not about, you know, having a certain set of genitals or so on, and you know, it's about the sort of, in fact, you know, a really good way to think about feminization as an economic phenomenon is to look at trans sex workers and their the sort of what is it, extractive abandonment, I think is a phrase that some Marxists use to explain how the sort of making surplus via feminization of certain populations can be very productive for capitalism and for the state. But feminization is something that you know, can be thought of as a sort of almost like a classing, like a classing of bodies that is fluid, and it's not kind of, you know, dependable, but you can use it, I think, to think about people within nuclear households who are you know, exposed to violence within the family. Like, I haven't talked about violence as much as I should, because it's not just privatization of labor that is at stake in the family, it's also violence which comes internally in the family and is also buttressed by external violence, right? There's sort of state racist terror that makes it very difficult to exit the family. There are economic factors that you know, contribute, but there's also, you know, yeah, frankly, you know, forms of violence that tear you know, families apart under the name of the family, funnily enough, right? When you have people at the border being kind of separated from one another, you know, children and parents, the only response we have as a left, kind of understandably, is keep families together, you know, stop family separations, which, you know, it gets the message across, you know, because it's a response on the terms of the state's attempt to say, you know, if we admitted you as a real family, you would be honored, and you would be, you know, in America we respect families, right? Which is, again, a massive racialized lie, right? Like, it only is operative for some people, some populations more specifically in America, right? And so targeting kin relationships at the border is actually part of the family regime. It's one of the forms of violence that sort of makes people feel, you know, that there is no alternative, you know, paradoxically. Just to be completely clear, you know, like the border guards aren't somehow abolishing the family by disrespecting family bonds. They're actually operating on the logic of the family's sort of sanctity. yeah, I think, you know, yeah, gosh, what more can I say? Yeah, I realized that was a very diffuse answer. I realized there's other things we need to get to. So, yeah, yeah. I think, just to reiterate, different sort of people within a household are structurally exposed to internal violence, and you can think of that internal violence as a site where perhaps it makes sense to talk about like you know, a solidarity, a natural solidarity between, let's say, women, children, you know, queer, trans, gender non-conforming people. I sometimes feel like pointing to the statistical fact that marriage is still very, very clearly beneficial to heterosexual cis men. So, you know, men live longer when they are married. Women live less long when they are married. When a heterosexual married couple gets sick, you know, if it's the woman who has a terminal illness, it tends to be then that the man divorces her and walks away from her care. When it is the man who gets terminally ill, the woman almost never divorces him in that moment, right? There are these kinds of statistical elements of the labor division that marriage ultimately is, right, organizes, even though neoliberalism has changed a lot about social reproduction, and, you know, marriage is no longer explicitly a property institution, you know, like wives are no longer property per se, you know, but the broad brushstrokes of that sort of private public labor division still obtain, you know, and still you know, basically boost the longevity of certain populations at the expense of others.
Okay, great. So if you have time for one more question, is there any sitting there that you want to point to? Unfortunately, we're not getting to all of the questions, but we have a couple outstanding. But
I noticed a really personal question, and I would be happy to even just sort of, you know, affirm it and listen to it, even if I don't have very concrete answers. But I noticed the person who said that they were wondering if I have advice about how to find, on a more immediate basis, people who are interested in giving and receiving care, or even interested in family abolition. I'm a queer single parent drowning under the burden of doing it all alone. I've been working for 2 years to connect with others and try to build, quote unquote, community, but it seems everyone is too busy with their own families, and I've had very little luck. I'm so tired of being lonely and overburdened. Yeah, as I say, I didn't want to ignore this, and I don't have a lot of sort of really concrete advice per se, but I feel like this experience is one that I hear a lot. People in my life, people outside of my immediate life, have expressed really, really similar experiences, you know. I think, you know, there was a moment earlier in the year where appetite still existed for experimenting with alternative forms, perhaps trying to start breaking down some of the institutions that naturalize, you know, the ultra privatization of our lives, the ultra atomization of our lives. But I think there was also a pendulum swing back to like normalization, like an appetite for normal, which is quite depressing, I think, for some of us. Yeah, I don't know where you're speaking from, you know, friend, but it's, I think, important to recognize that in cities where rents are really high and the cost of living is unbearable, and work is crushing people at an exceptionally high rate, that there is less, time literally that in people's hands, right? So, that's easy to say, but if you feel like the time has come to explore, different like locations where the boot of wage labor is less sort of heavily pressing down on people's necks, then you might find that there is more connection to be had. I found that myself in my life. I wish I could explain, I really do, how the sort of organized loneliness that this mode of production generates could be undone. I just don't know. Many of the solutions that people want to hear when editors ask me to write about this in a sort of unscary way, I think they really want to hear about bourgeois co-parenting solutions and things. But actually it's working class people who often innovate some of the most sort of creative, because of necessity, sort of ways of figuring out care, responsibilities and burdens, and distributing labor, which is what anti-work often is in the domain of care. When I say anti-work, I mean a horizon that doesn't call for automation or sort of stopping doing things, because with care, frequently people say what we need is more care, and it's not exactly that I disagree, but I think what needs to happen when we talk about care is that we understand what we care for and why in this world, which is dominated by a sort of religion of productivity, a religion of work, and which very specifically cares in certain ways for certain ends, and so I want to have conversations that are willing to talk about the worlds and the relations, and perhaps even the people, the classes that we wish to care for less or even not at all, and ask kind of about the qualitative dimensions of the care that we want to organize, not just the sort of the amount, because socially reproducing people is something we want to make visible as work, but not because that's a good thing. Like reproducing the world is actually something that I wouldn't want to own up to participating in, because the world is extremely violent, and this is also part of politicizing motherhood in a very unromantic way, right? Like mothers have helped build empire. Mothers have helped build eugenic regimes. Mothers are very much part of holding up patriarchy, right? The institution of motherhood itself, according to Adrienne Rich and others in the 70s, is patriarchal. This is why mothering against motherhood is a sort of anti-patriarchal insurgency against a patriarchal institution. So when you won't find necessarily already married couples who are turning their backs from you willing to kind of experiment like this, but you might find in surprising places like, I don't know, substance abuse support groups, or like community kitchens, places where people are already sharing resources. In my neighborhood there are really awesome kind of like food sharing resources and sort of community pantries and things, and I think people meet through those, and you might find that the appetite for resource sharing turns into an appetite for labor fusing. I hope you hang in there. It's kind of a depressing season and a depressing moment. I hope this hasn't been too rough on everybody. I think family abolition is simultaneously quite an exciting horizon that sometimes makes people feel really good, and I get lots of messages to that effect, even kind of showing me how it has helped people survive inside really nuclear settings. Like I get people sending me pictures of my books with babies or in maternity wards and birthing suites and breakfast tables full of children's sort of spoons and forks. But I also find that it sometimes awakens people to realizations about trauma and deficit and a sense of the scale of the problem. I really am grateful to all of you for your attention and your great questions, and to Miranda, who I believe has somewhat of a cold and has been battling through it for my sake, to host me here with such attention and skill. So that perhaps I should let her get off screen and into bed on this wintry Tuesday night.
So with that, yes, I am a little sick, but it's okay. That's why we're on Zoom. But this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to Dr. Sophie Lewis and the Andrea Mitchell Center. We'll cut off the, unfortunately, we did not get to all the questions, but we will cut off the event for now and, pay attention to future Andrea Mitchell Center events for attention to other subjects. Okay, I'm going to let us all go. Have a good night. Thank you so much.